Jarace Walker, the highest ranked commit in Houston history, is headed to the NBA. How's it going to turn out?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. I'm your host, Isaac Schade. We are joined today by our guy, Mr. Leif Thulin. Leif, always great to have you with us, friends. Don't forget that we are free and available anywhere you get podcasts, so make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. And to those of you who are everydayers joining us, thanks. So glad you're here. If you're not an everydayer, if you're not tuned in with us, hey, there's still plenty of time. Come hop on board. As you may well know, each week leading up to the NBA draft, what we're doing with our guy Leif is taking a look at a different draft prospect. And so this week, we start the show by looking at Houston's Jarace Walker. And then we're going to look at some other early entrants into the NBA draft. That timeline has closed off. And then Leif and I are going to make a couple predictions about who we think might come back to school and who we think might stay in the draft that might surprise you a little bit. So Leif, let's start with Jarace Walker. And I'll ask it to you this way to start. In a day and age when, we see a lot of bigs not being valued at the NBA level, what is it that sets Jarace Walker apart that makes NBA teams want this dude?
Well, I think the first thing is just his body is rare. You rarely get a guy that's as big and strong as he is that's able to move as quickly as he is. And I know that's a pretty simple thing if
but
you
it's
just
true.
think about it,
Yeah.
but it's true. I mean, you talk about the rarity of a guy like Kawhi Leonard and how long he is, how big he is. A couple of years ago, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate still, but it was 4 players ever had measurements that were in the same percentiles as Kawhi Leonard. It was Kawhi Leonard, it was Patrick Williams, OG Anunoby, and Tari Eason. And I'm thinking there might be someone else I'm missing, but it was 4 or 5. Anyway, long story short, I don't know if Jarace Walker's going to be quite in those measurements, but he will be darn close, if not, which means he's going to be 6'8", maybe 6'9" if he measures really well. He's going to have 7'2" wingspan and huge legs and just enormous hands. And I say all this to say this. He may not be Kawhi Leonard, but if you look at all those players, they're all wildly productive in their own regard. I think that Jarace Walker's calling card in terms of basketball, regardless of size and position, is defense. I think he can play multiple positions on defense. And then kind of the swing skill that if you're going to be drafting him, I've seen him as far as top 5 in a draft, and I've seen him as low as 11 or 12. If you're going to take him on the higher end of that, you want to really hope that his shooting, the flashes you saw at Houston where he could shoot the 3, but it wasn't horribly consistent, you want that to be consistent. I think that's the swing skill. If he can shoot threes and do a little bit more of the bounce and then he showed at Houston, being a freshman on a number 1 seed team, which is very, very possible and probably likely, then you may have a guy who is a two-way star. That said, I think his floor is really, really high, and the ceiling is more of an unknown to me. So he's one of the guys I'm more torn on personally.
Because I'm with you. Every mock draft I've looked at, I mean, just about top 10 everywhere, maybe falling as low as 11 or 12, as you said. If you were an NBA GM and you had a lottery pick, is it you would take him if the personnel need was there?
Yes, I think so. For me, I've got a big board. So this is not like a mock draft. It's not 14, right. But right now I've got him at 9. And I think that's lower than most people, but I think that's just because I have a couple players that I think have tremendous upside, namely G.G. Jackson, that I have ahead of him. And so that's one where he's not really hurt by my own evaluation of him, just my evaluation of others has him lower on my board as compared to some others. I've had him as high as 7. So for me, he's kind of stuck in that 7 through 9 range. And I know teams are going to be tantalized by what he could do in practices. I've heard many, many reports say, you haven't seen Jarace Walker when you watch Houston play. You see Jarace Walker when you watch Houston practice. And that has me really intrigued, but it's something that I'll never be able to see in that. And I wonder, what is his true skill set like that he's not able to do for Houston in the moment because they've got these veteran guards that are the leaders of the ships in Jamal Shed and Marcus Sasser. So I'm curious. I wonder if he's got more ball skills than was indicated. I wonder if he's a better facilitator because he shows flashes of being a very good passer. But to me, it's a little different than facilitating, being like someone who's tasked with truly running an offense as a secondary creator rather than just he shows some good passing. And so he's the biggest mystery of the guys that you saw plenty of. Like I saw Houston tons of times. It's just
that's right.
You don't know what you're going to get from Jarace Walker each time you see Houston. So that's one that I would say of the top 10 picks, I've got like a very high floor, but I don't know what the ceiling is, and I'm very curious about that. And I've started to watch more film on him recently, and I'm still in that same boat. I watched him play against Miami, and he shot terribly, but there's these couple plays I watch, and he cuts off baseline immediately, then blocks a spin layup at the rim in the middle, and I'm like, okay, like that guy can be an all-NBA caliber defender. Now what's his offense? And you see him shoot 4 of 14. And then you watch another game against Virginia, and he lights them up in one of his first true road games. So there's a wide range for just like a 5-pick discrepancy of like 5th through 10th, really.
Yeah. And just to put a few numbers on it, this past year, he averaged 1.8 assists per game at Houston, shot 34.7% from 3, albeit on just 2.8 attempts per game. Leif, you talked about what might have been some of the hidden things that the public didn't get to see because of what he did at practice versus what Houston actually needed from him personnel-wise in games. Are those things that we will start to see flash in the draft lead up at the combine coming up 15th through 21st of May? Like, when will we start to see those things come to the surface and get a better idea of, maybe, as you said, we know that floor is super high, but when will we start to learn more about what that ceiling could be?
Well, I doubt he plays at the combine. Rarely do top 10 players do that. You might see him do some shooting drills. I think it's individual workouts. Some teams will ask him to do things that you didn't see him do for the Houston Cougars on the game court, but they saw him do in practices or heard that he could do in practices. And if he impresses scouts there, I could see him going 6th overall.
Wow.
Then I really do think he's kind of going to go 5th through 10th. Like, I don't think that there's going to be this enormous leap, and I don't think there's going to be an enormous slide for him either way. But I don't know if it'll be open to the public to see until the summer league, honestly. I'm just doubtful that he'll play in the combine. I hope he does. I'm planning on attending the combine.
Oh, good.
So I'm hoping to see the best players possible, but I would say it's very rare for a player to go in the lottery and play at the combine. Last year was an exception where Jalen Williams played, but he wasn't anticipated to be a lottery pick and then balled out and made himself one.
Yeah, he absolutely did. Congrats to Jalen Williams on that, by the way. So, Leif, is that, I mean, because the players ahead of him that you would have, whether it's the college guys or Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson or any of those dudes, are they ahead of him because not only do they have the high floor, but you have a better idea about what their ceiling is? Is that part of why they would slot ahead of him?
Yes, for the most part, I would say that most of these guys have high floors, but the reason I have them ahead of him is I think I can project their ceiling better. Yeah. And I could be lowballing Jarace Walker because his ceiling's more of an unknown. For instance, I've got him 9th. And if I were to, I mentioned G.G. Jackson's ahead of him, where I think his ceiling's tremendous. At Wembanyama, Scoot Henderson, Amen Thompson, Brandon Miller are pretty much everyone's top 4 in some regard. And then I've got Cam Whitmore as one of the other collegiate players ahead. I've seen a lot of people say Jarace Walker's better. I just think Cam Whitmore is projected to score more. I think the NBA fits his way of scoring, and I think he can be a good defender with all the traits he's got. And so that's the one where it's really kind of splitting hairs. And I have Cason Wallace as the other collegiate player ahead. And I think that may do with I can't see a way Cason Wallace fails. And I don't really see one for Jarace Walker either. So he's got a tremendously high floor, and I think an underrated ceiling that I think is easier to see because there's guys that fit the archetype of him. And I said this on the podcast last night. I don't think he's Drew Holiday, which is like a lot of people's favorite comp. Drew Holiday's a tremendous player, but there are knockoffs of Drew Holiday or just like Drew Holiday 2.0s and 3.0s that really succeed in the league. You haven't seen too many Jarace Walkers to base it off of.
No.
And that's a good thing, but it's also something that's a little scary if you're drafting in the top 10. Like, is his most similar player like someone like Paul Millsap, except he does it differently? Like, I don't know. And I typically don't rely on like, hey, has there been a player that's laid a precedent for them? But it also makes me nervous if you're taking a top 10 pick, especially if you're in the higher side, like we mentioned fifth earlier. There's a few swing skills. Like his offensive game is a relative unknown, and that's something that would concern me.
Yep.
But I am excited for him.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it's all about is while you want that high ceiling, if you're a front office, you got to mitigate the risk factor. And because of that unknown, that probably slides Jarace Walker down a little bit. But I'm with you to look at this guy, just the person as he walks around, but then look at his smoothness and what he does on the court. I'm very excited to see. And I hope he is a very unique player. Well, the NBA early entry draft deadline came and went this weekend. We had, as always, several notable late entries. We want to get to that list in just a second. But before we do so, I want to tell you about Built. Are you looking for a delicious snack, but you don't want all that sugar and calories? Then you got to try the best tasting protein bar out there, Built. If you're like me and you want some healthier snack choices this year, but you don't want to compromise on taste, then I've got just the thing for you in Built Bars and Built Puffs, which are healthy and taste amazing. What makes them so good? Well, one of the things is that they're covered in 100% real dark chocolate. And they come in great flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and more. Also, I'm not sure how Built does this, but on top of these bars tasting so good, they still have amazing macros. Just 130 calories or 4 grams of sugar, and yet a whopping 17 grams of protein. And here's some great news for you. Now you don't have to wait on a delivery to come from Built.com. You can run right on down to your local Walmart or Sam's Club, pick up a 4-count box of cookies and cream, or go get that bulk order at Sam's Club. Go ahead, try some Built. You won't be disappointed in it. A proud sponsor of the Locked On Network. Folks, thanks so much for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen every day. You everydayers, make sure you join us tomorrow when our guy Andy Patton will be right back with you to close out this week. All right, Leif. The draft deadline early entry was Sunday night, 11:59 p.m. And then obviously what then happens is because we're all trying to be in bed or staying up tweeting about it, when we wake up Monday morning, we get to learn a lot of these. On yesterday's show, I talked about Imani Bates, who decided to come out from Eastern Michigan. Folks, you can go back and listen to that. But a couple others that I wanted to note, Leif, and then I just have a little bit of a conversation about are Arthur Kaluma from Creighton, Norchad Omier from Miami, Kobe Brown from Missouri, and DaRon Holmes out of Dayton. As you look at this list of 4 guys, obviously there are other late entries as well, but these I thought were some of the notable ones. Any of these stand out to you as guys that are more likely to stay in and that would actually be drafted?
I think an interesting one would be Kaluma because all rumors were that he was going to go to Arizona, where he played high school basketball, where his college teammate Ryan Nembhard was supposed to go and ended up going to Gonzaga.
That's right.
And so now I feel like Kaluma likely stays in, which is an unfortunate kind of turn of events because had he stayed in last year, I think he had a chance to be a first-round pick. This year, I think he hurt his stock immensely. His team made the Elite Eight. I could talk about his other teammate, Trey Alexander, I think is a guy that will get picked and stays in. DaRon Holmes to me is the most interesting one, though, in terms of like my personal interest in terms of what I think is fascinating. I think he returns to school but goes to a different school, and I believe it'll be Duke. I've heard a lot of links between Duke and DaRon Holmes, and that would be quite a team. I think DaRon Holmes is perfectly draftable. Like right now, I would have him as a top 40 pick, and I'm not sure I'll say this. I think he hurt his stock this year by just kind of struggling down the stretch of the year where he was really, really good for parts and then had some interesting lapses and the team was bad. And I think the team hurt him. So that's why I think if he returns to school, he goes to a different team with more exposure and shows what he's got. and I'd imagine that if he returns to school, he'll transfer.
And that would be really interesting. I can't remember, and you might not either. Is he in the transfer portal as well already?
I think so. I'm not entirely certain though.
Okay, I'll check on that while we're talking. Meanwhile, what about Kobe Brown and Norchad Omier? Do you project that both of them will return to Miami and Missouri respectively? Do you think either of them stays in?
I expect Kobe Brown to stay in. He's someone that I really found to be an interesting player because he's got a unique frame, but he shoots the ball very, very well with size, and that's exactly what the NBA covets. And he's older, so I think he will stay in the draft. Norchad Omier, I'm curious to see because his running mates Isaiah Wong, Jordan Miller, and Nigel Pack, they're moving on. Does he stay and kind of reap the rewards of NIL money and a talented but a reloading Miami team? Or does he go to the draft and play like the undersized five? My hunch is that he returns to Coral Gables and plays for the Hurricanes again one more year and just maximizes his college career. So yeah, if I were to bet on those two, I think Kobe Brown's going to the draft. Coral Gables gets Norchad Omier back.
That'd be really interesting. I'm with you on Kaluma, by the way. I think, especially just, yes, the talent period, but we've gotten really adept through the years at reading these draft declarations and what's in them and what's not, and how players phrase things. And ultimately, for me, as I read Kaluma's thing, that reads like I'm done, I'm out, I'm not coming back. And so, I mean, it really feels that way to me. Do you get that same vibe and read from his statement?
Yeah, I thought that it was interesting that the Creighton team that was a point away from making the Final Four, losing by 1 point to San Diego State, disrupted the way it has. I saw them play against Baylor and against NC State, and they were one of the more connected teams than that I saw. And it's interesting that their leader, Ryan Nemhard, apparently, I've heard from a good source that he decided on their first game, like either before or after his first game, like he was transferring.
Wow.
And, then he played his second game. He scored 30 points against Baylor, like clearly didn't weigh that much on his mind. Kaluma, I thought might declare for the draft because he's older for a sophomore. And like he just, needed to not get ran out of the rotation because they had players that were better. Alexander, I think he was their best prospect of the bunch. So that made sense to me. Kalkbrenner played phenomenally all tournament. I don't know what he'll do. So to answer your question, I thought he was leaving regardless. But once I saw all this max exodus from a Elite Eight team, I felt like it had to be done. Like it was either Arizona or the NBA draft. There was no in between for Kaluma.
Man, that's so interesting. As for Holmes, he is not in the transfer portal yet. Obviously, we've got till May 11th for that while it remains open. So we'll have to keep tabs on that. Yeah, with Kalkbrenner, it's interesting because he hasn't declared for the draft, right? I'm double checking.
No, he hasn't. I don't think
he hasn't, and it's closed. So, I mean, he could still obviously enter the transfer portal, but as it stands right now, he will be back in school next year. Well, Leif and I want to continue giving some more ideas about guys who we think might come back to school, maybe some surprises, and who we think would be maybe some surprises to stay in the draft. We're going to wrap up today's conversation with that fun conversation in just a second. All right, Leif. So we've been talking about some of these guys that declared for the NBA draft late and what we think they might or might not do. In terms of just overall looking at it, I think it's always fun to play the prediction game because half the time we're going to be wrong anyway. But who are some guys that we think might come back to college for any various reasons, and some guys who we think might stay in the draft? Let's start with who we think will be coming back to school. Why don't you go?
That's an interesting one because a lot of the people that have declared were more surprising, so it makes me think they'll go. I'll give a hopeful one. I'm hopeful Reese Beekman returns.
Love that.
Because I think he solidified early in the season that he was an NBA quality guard. But the latter stage of the season, he was hampered by hamstring injuries, a not great team, and just didn't look like himself. So I wonder if he wants to put better film when the reins are securely in his hands. There's no more Kihei Clark, and he's going to play as the on-ball guard. He was anyway, but like the on-ball guard for Virginia, score the ball more than he did. So that's one I'd be curious and kind of hopeful to see him return. And one more that would be surprising would be Andre Jackson. He just won a national championship. He was the key cog for UConn, where they make this run. And people who watch college basketball like yourself and I, we're not surprised with what he did. But NBA scouts have their attention on him now. And I wonder if he returns because he's just I've heard reports that he's just the ultimate like UConn guy. Like he loves it there. He loves Hurley. He wants to play college basketball and get the most out of it for himself as humanly possible. I'm not going to say he's absolutely going to do it, but considering the exodus that happens when you win a national championship, like typically people are like, oh my God, my stock's never going to be higher. I'm going. I think it'd be pretty surprising to most people to see him return. And I would say I wouldn't be terribly surprised.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. And I'm very curious to see what both he and Tristan Newton do, because if they're both back, could be interesting on that. And going back to Reese Beekman, what I love about what you said with that is clearly he has established all of his defensive bona fides. He's been the ACC Defensive Player of the Year, all of that. But I like the thought of like now with Kihei Clark kind of out of the way. I know that sounds worse than I actually mean it. What is he able to do running the team and doing things as a facilitator and in that way? And I think that would really help his stock. So I would love that too. And always, obviously, a good thing for college basketball to get some of those big names back. Two for me, and I've actually kind of cheated on one of them. Number one is, this is not my cheat, but Zach Edey. I really think he might legitimately come back to school. I know there's because he's Canadian, you got to work around the NIL stuff, but you can do that and get this man paid. I feel like part of it is he's got this bitter taste in his mouth from how this past year ended. And I'm not saying Purdue's going to turn around and do what Virginia did after getting beaten by a 16 seed, but I just think there's even more for Zach Edey to do. Keep in mind, folks, he is relatively new to the game of basketball, and I think there's even more that could be done. And what does that team in total look like with Smith and Lawyer being sophomores in the backcourt? So I would love to see that. And then the one where I'm going to cheat is I'm going to say that both Devo Davis and Jordan Walsh come back to Arkansas. I know that Eric Musselman has absolutely loaded up on seemingly every guard in America in the transfer portal. And so I know that makes it crowded with Devo Davis coming back, but with what he's been able to do and what he would be as a returner, I think that would be great. For Jordan Walsh, I know as a front court player, there's lots of time and space available, but I just think there's more for him to prove. It's going to be a while before Trevon Brazile gets back and playing. And so, I mean, for the Arkansas of it, they would obviously love to have Walsh back as well. So that's kind of my twofold who I think would be an interesting look at to come back to school out of the draft. Leif, let's turn the leaf. Nice. And look at the other side of that. You've never heard that joke in your life before, I'm sure. Who are a couple that might be a surprise to you to stay in, or maybe some that people would not expect to stay in the draft?
That's an interesting one. I think there are some guys that would be surprising considering how they performed in college basketball, but not consider the way they were billed entering the year. So Makes essentially sense. what Peyton Watson did last year is carved out like a pathway. Yep. He scored like 3.5 points per game for UCLA last year. And he was the 30th pick, which is first round. It's guaranteed money. It's a 4-year contract. And then it actually looks like it's going to work out. I saw him firsthand, and he was a very impactful defensive player this year for the Nuggets. So the guy that follows that archetype the most to me would be Julian Phillips, someone who was on a stacked team that was defensively oriented, and he showed flashes. He shot 80% from the free throw line. He was a good defender, was active. And then the other one's Dylan Mitchell that fits that same narrative. Had zero skills, but he is a freak freak athlete. And so I think he'll stay in the draft. That people might be like, why on earth is he going to the draft? And I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if he's picked 28 through 30th, where he gets a guarantee and someone takes a swing. One more that isn't quite of that same ilk, but I just wanted to put those two in the same.
Thank you for
same
using the word
category
ilk,
to me.
by the way.
Thank you. I would say this one. I don't know if people are gonna love. I wonder if Bobby Klintman. This is my big swing in the dark right here. Bobby Klintman is someone that I think's got really good upside, and people can see him in a workout, and he raised his stock tremendously because even the people who listen to this show may not know who Bobby Klintman is. He's a Wake Forest guy who had flashes throughout the year in the ACC tournament. He had one of his better games, and that's where a lot of scouts view him. So I'd be interested to see if he stays in the draft, and that'd be a real shock. That's probably my boldest call, but I think there's a couple guys like Olivier Maxence Prosper from Marquette probably stays in as well. Yeah. That would be somewhat surprising based off like pure statistics production, but makes sense from a NBA draft perspective. Like he's a big, strong guy who plays great defense.
In fact, Max Prosper was my guy just off of my list that I almost included. I love the Klintman call. Leif Thulin, let's mark this day down, and we'll have to circle back around to it as things come. My two that I have staying in, I've got a bigger name, kind of like I did with Zach Edey, and then another. My bigger name is Oscar Tshiebwe. I think at this point, it's kind of a similar thing with Drew Timme, where it's like, I get it. Coming back would be incredible. And the NIL opportunities, although there is the same confusion with NIL stuff as there is with Zach Edey, because it's like he's not an American citizen. So you got to have the legal workarounds and all that. That makes it sound like I'm saying Kentucky's going to do something illegal. That's not what I'm saying. Just it takes some legal maneuvering to make that work. But at the end of the day, it just feels like, with Tshiebwe's knee injury to start the season last year, it took him a while to get going, and he just didn't have the level of production that he did the year before, although he had a great year. It's just he wasn't the player he was the year before. So I think there is a world in which him coming back, he could have a more productive year again, but he's given the Kentucky staff's blessing to move forward with Hunter Dickinson and others to essentially replace him. And he said his desire would be to stay in. And I think ultimately that is what he will do. The other one for me is kind of a similar thing, is Malachi Smith from Gonzaga, who had been at Chattanooga the year before. You know, he had a solid year at Gonzaga. He didn't go up there and be the star or out in major ways. And so really, and obviously, Leif, you would know more than this as somebody who studies and is in on draft stuff all the time, but it really feels like he didn't really do much to his draft status either way this year at Gonzaga. It just kind of felt like even keel in terms of draftability from what he did at Gonzaga. And so to that point, unless he would come back and there's hope of him just blowing up and really doing something, it's like, yeah, I went to Gonzaga. I tried to make a bigger splash. It didn't happen, but I also didn't fall. So might as well just stay in and see what happens this year. What do you think on that?
That's an interesting one because on one hand, he's older now. Yep. So that makes him more likely to go to the draft because rarely do you really impress draft evaluators by being older and playing in the WCC.
Yeah.
But if I were him, I'm not really making a comment on what I think will happen because I just have no idea. If I were him, I'd probably stay at Gonzaga and try to be a lead guard at Gonzaga, whereas it's more appealing than it was at Chattanooga. And towards the end of the year, I mean, I think he was a huge reason they beat TCU, and that got them to that would make that the Sweet 16, and they won again and got to the Elite Eight. So I would stay, but I don't know. I like that prediction because that's someone that's off the radar, but who's got NBA desired skill set where he's a defensively oriented guard who's shown he can play a role. That said, it's pretty rare for a guy to come off the bench and then say, you know what, I'm going to make it. Like the exceptions to that are typically freshmen like Patrick Williams at Florida State, where he was on a loaded team, scored 10 a game off the bench, and has all those traits I mentioned that were in the same like just percentiles as Kawhi Leonard, who is the archetype of 3-and-D wings.
Right.
So I would probably stay if I was Malachi Smith, but I could see that happening very easily. Like that's a bold call I like.
Hey, that's what we're trying to do here sometimes, Leif. But yeah, you talk about that backcourt. Like if you had him and Ryan Nembhard going, Gonzaga could really turn around who they were with those backcourt struggles last year. Folks, thanks so much for tuning in to the show today. Thanks as always to our guy, Leif Thulin. You can follow him on Twitter at Leif Thulin. That's THULIN and LEIF in Leif. You can follow me at Isaac Schade and follow the show on Twitter as well. If you would, go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a great review, 5 stars, and some wonderful comments on the show. So you can subscribe to us, smash the like button, leave comments on your thoughts on any of these prospects, from Jarace Walker to any of the other draft entrants we've talked about. As always, my apologies to the Lawyer family. Go Wildcats, and until tomorrow, peace.